Before the likes of the Squidge brothers, Hugh Griffin, or even the aptly titled Rugby Nause, there was Arthur Conan Doyle. I'm Hattie, and today, in the 20th episode of the Rugby History Project, we're looking at rugby's first Nause. Thank you for watching and listening. The Rugby History Project is able to keep going thanks to the support of people like you. If you'd like to upgrade to a paid subscription and join the Historian tier, or if you'd just like to leave me a little one-off tip, please click the link in the description of this podcast. Rugby Nause. A person who is an obsessive fan of the sport of rugby union, to the point they could be considered an expert of the game. They may have a distinct special interest in an element of the sport such as statistics, its history, or a specific in-game feature such as line-outs or scrums. Their obsession may lead to them being deemed boring, irritating and or annoying by others due to their ability to shoehorn rugby into any conversation. Andrew Nolan, better known by his social media handle Rugby Nause, has done wonders for the reputation of Rugby Nauses worldwide. Once upon a time, a Nause would spend their time receiving sighs in the club bar as they waxed lyrically about the benefits of shortened line-outs or the demise of the drop goal. In 2026, Nauses are able to share their opinions and thoughts with other Nauses on various social media platforms or even on their own website or podcast. However, at the turn of the 20th century, one of the most well-known authors in the world was able to use his own fiction writing as an outlet for his Nause tendencies. Arthur Conan Doyle was born Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle on the 22nd of May 1859 in Edinburgh to parents of Irish descent. Whilst his paternal grandfather had been a successful cartoonist, Doyle's nuclear family struggled financially due to his father's alcoholism. With a wealthy family and middle-class connections, Doyle was able to attend Stonyhurst College, a Catholic public school in Lancashire. It was at Stonyhurst that Doyle first played football. Stonyhurst played a football-rugby hybrid, like many public schools. They had adapted the laws prior to codification. Doyle reflected on his love of rugby and the specific code played at Stonyhurst in his autobiography, Memories and Adventures, published in 1924. If boxing is the finest single-man sport, I think that rugby football is the best collective one. Strength, courage, speed and resource are great qualities to include in a single game. I have always wished that it had come to more in my way of life, but my football was ruined, as is many a man's, by the fact that my old school they played a hybrid game peculiar to the place, with excellent points of its own, but unfitting the youngster for any other. All these local freak games, war games, Winchester games and so on are national misfortunes, for while our youths are wasting their energies upon them, those precious early energies which make the instinct players, the young South African or New Zealander is brought up on the real universal rugby, and so comes over to pluck a few more laurel leaves out of our depleted wreath. In Australia, I have seen in Victoria a hybrid, though excellent game of their own, but they have had the sense in other parts to fall into line and are already taking the same high position which they hold in other branches of sport. I hope that our headmasters will follow the same course. Despite deeming himself to not be as good of a player as he could have been, Doyle did play for the University of Edinburgh School of Medicine several times during his time as a student. During the 1870s, it was not uncommon for established university sides such as Edinburgh's Medical School to be made up of virtually all internationally capped players. So Doyle's appearances as a forward for the side are more impressive than he made them out to be. Doyle certainly continued to watch rugby after graduating, with it being reported in the Hampshire Post that Doyle was in attendance at a South Seas Victoria game in 1888, which resulted in one H.C. Brown receiving severe lacerations on his leg. Beyond rugby and rugby-like games, Doyle was an avid sportsman. Cricket and association football seemed to be his preferred pastimes after leaving university, with him playing cricket for Marylebone Cricket Club and soccer for Portsmouth AFC. He was also known to enjoy golf, skiing, rifle shooting and cycling. His love of sport resulted in an entire chapter in his autobiography being devoted to the subject. As one grows old, one looks back at one's career in sport as a thing completed. Yet, I have at least held on to as long as I could, for I played a hard match of association football at 44 and I played cricket for 10 years more. I've never specialised and have therefore been a second-rater in all things. I've made up for it by being an all-rounder and have had, I dare say, as much fun out of sport as many an adept. It would be odd if a man could try as many games as I have for so many years without having some interesting experiences or forming a few opinions on which would bear recording and discussion. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote his first notable piece of fiction at the age of 27. A Study in Scarlet initially struggled to find a publisher, finally being accepted by Ward Lock & Co., although it wouldn't be published until over a year later. The 1887 publication of the novel introduced the world to consulting detective Sherlock Holmes and his flatmate, Dr. John Watson. Over the course of 4 decades, Doyle wrote and published 56 short stories and 4 full-length novels, known to fans as the canon, involving the duo. Whilst the sheer volume of the canon is astounding, it is simply a fraction of Doyle's total output. With over 200 short stories, 22 novels, 14 plays, and a selection of non-fiction books, Doyle was one of the most prolific writers of all time. Whilst the canon is a cornerstone of detective fiction, writing in general was an outlet for Doyle to share his knowledge of his own hobbies and interests. Whilst there are references to other aspects of Doyle's real life in his fiction, with Holmes himself being based on one of Doyle's university lecturers, Joseph Bell, sport, specifically rugby, has had some of the most gratuitous and self-serving mentions. There are 4 fictional stories which mention rugby in some form across his bibliography. The Firm of Girdlestone was serialised in 25 parts in the People newspaper between October 1889 and April 1890, and published in a bound copy shortly thereafter. As a serialised novel, readers on the morning of the 17th of November 1889 may have been confused and slightly amused when an entire chapter was devoted to a fictionalised version of the 1877 Home Nations match between Scotland and England. Chapter 7, titled England vs Scotland, is rather irrelevant to the plot of the novel, but it does feature one of the leading characters, Tom Dimsdale, as a Scotland player. Dimsdale ends up as the Scottish hero as he kicks the final drop goal to win the game, and also the tournament, although he does break his collarbone in the process. The Firm of Girdlestone features probably the most gratuitous mention of rugby in Doyle's fiction, and notably, it's also the only piece of fiction that sits outside of the Sherlock Holmes canon that features rugby. Doyle had originally killed off the character of Sherlock Holmes in 1893 in the story The Final Chapter. Doyle had become bored with the Holmes stories and felt they were preventing him from writing more serious literature. Killing off Sherlock seemed the easiest way out. Less than a decade later, however, Doyle would return to writing Holmes stories, firstly with The Hound of the Baskervilles, which was set 2 years before the final chapter, and in 1903 public pressure led to Sherlock Holmes' death being revealed to be a hoax. Doyle was facing extreme financial pressure at the time, as his wife Louisa was suffering from tuberculosis, so it's perhaps not surprising that he returned to writing such a lucrative character. In 1904, Doyle once again utilised his love of rugby in his work with the release of 2 Sherlock Holmes short stories featuring the sport. The first, The Adventure of the 3 Students, was published in June 1904 in the Strand magazine. The story follows the investigation of a ransacking of a lecturer's office, presumably by a student wishing to cheat on an upcoming exam. One of the lead suspects is a student known only by his surname, Gilchrist. Gilchrist is noting for being member of the rugby and cricket teams by the lecturer, and Watson describes him as being welcoming during their investigation. It's later discovered, however, that Gilchrist is responsible for the deed, with Holmes deducing that only a man of Gilchrist's height would have been able to view the contents of the printer's proofs. Gilchrist informs his lecturer that he will not be sitting the exam, as he's decided to move to South Africa to join the Rhodesian police. Whilst Chapter 7 of The Firm of Girdlestone is the most detailed account of rugby in Doyle's bibliography, The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter is the Doyle story most well known for its rugby-related content. Published at the Strand in August 1904, The Missing Three-Quarter follows Holmes's investigation into the disappearance of a University of Cambridge winger. It is made clear throughout the text that Holmes himself has no knowledge of rugby or even sport. This is first evidenced in the opening few paragraphs when he struggles to decipher the following telegram. Please await me. Terrible misfortune. Right wing 3/4 missing. Indispensable tomorrow. Overton. Cyril Overton is described as being a large man who fills the doorway of 221B Baker Street. Initial confusion and miscommunication stall the first few pages, as Overton assumes that a man such as Holmes must know of him. It is revealed that Overton was previously in the English national team as a reserve and is the University of Cambridge varsity captain. Overton tells Holmes that his friend and teammate Godfrey Staunton is missing, having last been seen in the team hotel looking distressed. Staunton is described as being key to his team, with incredible rugby pedigree. "Great Scott," cried the athlete. "Why, I was first reserve for England against Wales, and I've skippered the varsity all this year." "But that's nothing. I didn't think there was a soul in England he didn't know Godfrey Staunton. The crack three-quarter, Cambridge, Blackheath, and 5 internationals. Good Lord, Mr. Holmes, where have you lived?" Holmes laughed at the young giant's naive astonishment. "You live in a different world to me, Mr. Overton, a sweeter and healthier one. My ramifications stretch out into many sections of society, but never, I'm happy to say, into amateur sport, which is the best and soundest thing in England. However, your unexpected visit this morning shows me that even in this world of fresh air and fair play, there may be work for me to do. So now, my good sir, I beg you to sit down and tell me slowly and quietly exactly what it is that has occurred, and how you desire that I should help you." The missing three-quarter demonstrates Doyle's love of rugby pretty well. His inability not to praise the amateur nature of rugby, even through the dialogue of Holmes, is pretty notable. However, the actual plot of the story, which involves tracking down Godfrey Staunton via a telegram Staunton had exchanged with the doctor. Interestingly, Doyle chose to include tuberculosis as a central theme of the story, the illness from which his own wife was dying from. Both The Adventure of the Three Students and The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter were later published within the anthology The Return of Sherlock Holmes in 1905. Doyle would only mention rugby once more in the canon, when prospective client drops into a conversation that Watson had previously played for Blackheath when he had played for Richmond in the 1924 story The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire. It is slightly odd that this fact had never been mentioned before, especially as in The Missing Three-Quarter, the aforementioned three-quarter is said to have played at the club. However, it does highlight how rugby was used as a form of social networking in middle-class Victorian Britain. None of Doyle's rugby-focused works are particularly well known or even celebrated, at least in comparison to classics such as The Hound of the Baskervilles or A Scandal in Bohemia. Few adaptations have been made of the 4 stories, especially in film. Whilst no film version of The Missing Three-Quarter has ever been made, references to the 3 students were made in an episode of the American television show Elementary. An adaptation of The Sussex Vampire was made by Granada Television in 1993. Non-Holmes story The Firl of Girdlestone was adapted in 1958 by the BBC. However, it's difficult to find a copy online to check if the infamous rugby scenes were included. Recently, both The Three Students and The Missing Three-Quarter have been adapted as a part of the Sherlock & Co podcast, although the producers of the show chose to replace rugby with gym bros and soccer, and utilise the voice acting abilities of former soccer players Gary Lineker and Alan Shearer. Rugby was not the only sport that Doyle wrote about. Even if you exclude the sports only mentioned in his non-fiction writing, he still managed to squeeze in mentions of tennis, archery, ballooning, motorsports, cycling, horse riding, shooting, skiing, and golf into his fiction. He also included boxing heavily in his fiction writing, including the sport in 12 of his short stories. Whilst Doyle enjoyed team and non-contact sports, he considered boxing to be the peak of athleticism. Whilst he described himself as a fair average amateur, he nonetheless recounts various examples of incidents where he sparred with near strangers as part of a Victorian middle-class bonding ritual. However, he also decried the manner he felt boxing was falling to during the 1920s. "Better that our sport should be a little too rough than we should run a risk of effeminacy. But the ring outlasted its time. It was ruined by the villainous mobs who cared for nothing for the chivalry of the sport or the traditions of British fair play as compared with the money gain which the contest might bring. Their blackguardianism drove out the good men, the men who really did uphold the ancient standards, and so the whole institution passed into rottenness and decay. But now the glove contest carried on under discipline of the national sporting or other clubs perpetuate the noble old sport without a possibility of the more evil elements creeping into it once more. An exhibition of hardihood without brutality, of good-humoured courage without savagery, of skill without trickery is, I think, the very highest which sport can give. People may smile at the mittens, but a 20-round contest with 4-ounce gloves is quite as punishing as an ordeal as one wished to endure. There is as little room for a coward in the rougher days of old, and the standard of endurance is probably as high as in the average prize fight. The inclusion of sport in so much of Doyle's work is a reflection of his education and his standing in society. Christian masculinity was a focus of British public schools, and the importance of sport, especially team sports such as rugby and cricket, carried through into adulthood. Doyle's writing reflected the middle-class society in which he was raised and which he operated. Introductions through referencing the sporting clubs to which somebody belonged would have been completely normal and an accepted facet of middle-class life in Britain at the time. In fact, one of the major attractions of sporting clubs were the connections that they could grant you. With old boys networks becoming less of a factor in society and the professionalisation of sport, it's not surprising that these references have largely been dropped from Holmes' adaptations in the 21st century. As a self-described rugby Nause, I thought an investigation into the first ever rugby Nause would be a fun little article. I've tried not to give away too many unnecessary details in case you wish to read any of the texts. They are all now in the public domain, so you can either buy a copy or there's free PDFs widely available on the internet. I have linked all of the free PDFs that I could find for relevant texts on my website. They're just in the references section of this article. If you'd like to see me more regularly, you can check out my Instagram, Twitter and/or Blue Sky, and Facebook now. Weird. You can also catch me podding with Rap and Rugby Treehouse, kind of often at the moment. And a written version of this post full of references, images, etc. is available on my website, therugbyhistoryproject.com, which is also where you can find the Rugby History Project shop.